All right. Did you want to kick off the meeting, George?
No, I'd like you to kick off the meeting.
Oh, okay. Over me. So I do have a slide deck presentation sort of summarizing key takeaways from the very dense packet that you all received ahead of this meeting. But before that, I think we did have, thanks to Jessica DeRoy, who helped step in with some of the meeting minutes for the subcommittee. We do have the October 24th and November 7th meeting minutes. Do you want to wait for Sandy to vote on those?
Yeah, why don't we put those at the end of the meeting? If she's not here, we'll just vote on them.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, I'm going to pull up my slide deck. So we are in the process of wrapping up our recommendations for the Chestnut Hill commercial area study. This is the diagram summarizing the key components of the study. This is an updated timeline about where we're at in terms of progress towards completion for the zoning recommendations, the design guidelines, the transportation infrastructure improvements, the MOA, and the report itself and the zoning warrant articles. So we're wrapping up zoning design guidelines, all the other recommendations, waiting to have those pieces fully set before we roll them all up into a report format. So this is a wordy overview, but I did want to circle back because we had talked about the progress we've made for the transportation study for Chestnut Hill and the conceptual improvements that we have put together with Kittleson and Associates were sort of whittled down. I think we removed a couple of concepts like the quadrant proposal at Heath Street and Hammond, and presented sort of the scope of those conceptual improvements to the Transportation Board at their meeting earlier this month. And they did adopt that as a sort of a formal planning document. And this is helpful because it just allows economic development to continue working in partnership with the Transportation Engineering Division to move those proposed improvements forward as resources become available, as staff capacity allows, and continue having conversations with stakeholders like City of Newton, Mass DOT, and DCR about how do we continue to explore those. We understand that for each of those recommendations, there's a lot of additional planning, project development, but then also public process involved in all of that. So that is something that we're identifying as part of the implementation portion of the transportation recommendations. So the next step is we are working on getting the inputs that Kittleson needs to do their infrastructure capacity testing. We've made some assumptions and we're very conservative about sort of what we could potentially see redeveloped under the proposed rezoning to get a sense of what that would mean in terms of the capacity and function of Chestnut Hill. And I did see Ken's hand go up.
Yeah, real quick, did I understand you to say then you've eliminated the R-cut option or no?
No, we eliminated the quadrant alternative that they proposed for Heath and Hammond, but the R-cut is still on the table as something that needs additional exploration.
Okay.
So, okay, transportation study. We are also in the process of negotiating a memorandum of agreement with City Realty. We are, working with the select board and provided updates about sort of the status of that and the substance of those discussions. And I wouldn't be able to share that publicly until that's something the select board has signed off on. But George had asked that I just provide sort of an overview of the key themes and issues that are currently addressed in the MOA. And so we're certainly very focused on, commercial tax base expansion and preservation. So there's a tax certainty commitment included in that. And then some proposals in terms of penalties in the event that there's extended delay in bringing the commercial square footage that's required as part of the overlay online and onto the tax rolls. Infrastructure mitigation, funding for infrastructure mitigation and improvements, which is identified as part of the zoning requirements. Some other commitments in terms of commercial area vibrancy enhancements like public art, some sustainability initiatives, and then an acknowledgement of the existing obligations City Realty has. So that would be the reiterating of their inclusionary zoning bylaw compliance. So that's the contribution to the Affordable Housing Fund and the commitment to on-site units, which was negotiated with the HAB. And that negotiation was facilitated heavily by Ken Lewis and a lot of the work that he did with some of the HAB members in preparation for that discussion, reiterating the fossil fuel free requirement, and then funding to address any of the construction impacts.
Meredith, are there drafts going back and forth now? Has this reached that stage of drafting?
Yes.
Good.
Hey, Meredith, just quick question. Under the tax base question, if one of the first tenants happens to be sort of an institutional use, be it university, hospital, medical, how does that sort of addressed?
So I think if they were so the tax certainty agreement would require that we still receive the taxes, but I think if it was an institutional tenant, they don't own the property, so they'd still be required to pay taxes.
All right. So, or if it's sold off, but just that there's this somehow sort of tax certainty, irrespective of the use, is kind of the, yeah. Okay.
Sure. Okay. And then, so the draft that you received for the zoning was circulated over the weekend. We have already received and are in the process of incorporating several changes based on a very deep dive discussion that we had with building department and our regulatory division in reviewing the zoning language. Ken submitted some very thoughtful comments. Steve Hyken just submitted some helpful comments. So we're in the process of reviewing all of this and integrating, any edits, addressing any issues that have been raised. And I'm assuming that today's conversation is also going to be very helpful in terms of identifying some additions or amendments to the current draft. I did want to, I think, provide an overview of, since the last time the subcommittee met, sort of what are the key changes that we've incorporated. So again, overview of the 4 sub-districts. And we can flip through, if it's helpful, to have more of a visual, the design guidelines and the massing control section of that. So I'd say the most sort of substantial changes that we made from previous drafts of the zoning is that we reduced the maximum height proposed for the 3.0 commercial subdistrict and the transit-oriented subdistrict from 10 to 12 stories to 7. And then there was a lot of back and forth regarding the setback requirements in the 4.0 subdistrict, so we sort of simplified those. We refined the step back requirements across the overlay district. We added a substantial 60-foot step back at 7 stories as sort of a bookend on the 4.0, just to help with the transition and scale as we move to the sub-districts on the other side of Holly Lane. And then we're still working on refining the frontage ratio requirements, which are one of the tools that we're using to help reinforce this north-south reorientation that City Realty proposed in their most recent iteration, and that I think across the board people feel was very effective in helping to mitigate the impacts of the height and the massing. So we also worked on refining the ground floor commercial requirements. That's something I have a slide about, sort of how the ground floor commercial requirement is applied currently in the zoning language, and I'd love your feedback on whether you think that's effective, if it needs to be expanded. And we also added language trying to just make sure that we're protecting the commercial square footage that is added as part of this, and saying that that commercial square footage has to remain for the life of the building. And then we also, I think something I'm anticipating some discussion and feedback about is, and Kara can help provide some additional thoughts around this, but, as we were working with Sasaki and, you know, we were talking about the max heights and FAR earlier on in this process. And since then, you know, we've added the step backs and the setback requirements, and have a clear sense of sort of where the max heights are going to fall. So we felt that the application of the FAR in all the other sub-districts, aside from the 4.0, there was sort of a greater risk of not appropriately calculating that and then have an unintended consequence of not being able to support, you know, the type of development that we'd like to see in these sub-districts. So we sort of proposing this form-based zoning light for these other sub-districts. I'd be very curious to hear what your thoughts are on that. And then we had, as a carryover from earlier drafts, this idea of having different record grade for each of the different sub-districts. So we're sort of streamlining that, and, you know, just having a more consistent standard and across the entire zoning overlay. We're going to flip over to the Sasaki diagrams, if that would be helpful to people, but I did want to include just a summary slide about the proposed maximum building heights across the sub-districts. So in the 4.0, you have the maximum height of 150 with a potential bonus of 175. And then we're limiting the height on the western boundary to 88 feet, and then applying that on the eastern side as well, as a 60-foot setback. And the 3.0 and the TOM max height of 88 feet. And then in the neighborhood mixed use as sort of the standard, we have max 50 feet at about 4 stories, and then eligible for up to 75 feet with a bonus, which Ken had some helpful questions and thoughts on. So I'm hoping we get the chance to talk about that. And then just as a summary of where we're at, you know, I think in earlier drafts, the bonus applied to both height and FAR. And so we've reworked it where the bonus height really, so bonus is limited to height and it's applicable in the 4.0 and in the neighborhood mixed use. And in the 4.0 area, it's 12 stories, but you have the potential to get up to 14 stories if you have 60% of your proposal includes commercial square footage. And then in the neighborhood mixed use, it's 4 stories with the ability to go up to 6 stories for 2 options, either for hotel use or if your proposal includes a minimum of 50% on-site affordable units. And the affordable height bonus was inspired by some of the recommendations and conclusions from the HAB's Affordable Housing Overlay District Subcommittee and sort of where those recommendations landed. And I would defer to Steve on sort of the details of that process and where that landed. And in terms of the minimum commercial square footage requirement of at least 51%, that's applicable to the 4.0 and 3.0 sub-districts. And there's the minimum ground floor commercial requirement of 60% of your ground floor frontage has to be for commercial uses. And that applies across the entire district, with the exception of Heath Street, Sheaf Street, Dunster Road. And then we added in the flexibility to receive a waiver for the ground floor commercial requirement, kind of at the periphery of the sub-district, or sorry, of the broader district. So I will pause here and just see what would be most helpful. Should I flip over to the Sasaki massing control section? Are there questions or things you'd like to talk about just based on these slides?
Yes, I'd put it back to you. I mean, this is dense and a lot to absorb.
Sure.
If you haven't been involved in the process, and we haven't been involved in the process for a little bit, what would be most helpful to you in terms of input from this subcommittee?
So I think touching upon some of the questions that Ken had raised in his edits of the draft would be helpful. I did have a specific, would love feedback on the amount of flexibility we should incorporate in the ground floor commercial requirement.
And the FAR question.
Yeah, and the FAR question.
What specifically is your question? Are your questions there?
Sure. Here, I will go back to my slide deck. Do you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So this is clearly not a Sasaki produced graphic. This is me just trying to provide some visuals to facilitate a conversation. So this slide, trying to identify sort of where sections that are exempt from the ground floor commercial requirement, and then where we have proposed areas where they're eligible for a waiver from the ground floor requirement altogether. So the sections of the overlay district that are exempt from the ground floor minimum commercial requirement would be along the entire length of Heath Street, Sheaf Street, and Dunster Road. Where we have included in the current zoning the potential to receive a waiver for having the ground floor commercial requirement are on the western, eastern, and northernmost kind of peripheries boundaries of the proposed overlay district. And the rationale behind it is that, you know, as you move farther from the, you know, core central area of the district, it might be more challenging for ground floor commercial space to be successful there. So I'm curious to hear whether you would subscribe to that thinking, and if you feel that the waiver eligible areas are appropriate or should be shortened or expanded. And then Ken had also raised some questions about sort of the recommended criteria that the planning board might use in its recommendation to the zoning board of appeals about why a waiver would be appropriate.
So let me chime in here and just say ground floor retail in current market and foreseeable future is very difficult unless you have a destination, or a lot of foot traffic. And from my point of view, what you're going to end up with east of Hammond Street on Route 9 is a bunch of empty storefronts. They're just, I mean, you'll have maybe a coffee shop as a destination with parking, but that's just not a good ground floor retail stretch. It just isn't. It's, you know, there's no there. And I think you're just asking for empty storefronts. So I would favor a waiver from really the new development at the corner of Hammond all the way to the eastern boundary.
So George, you're saying this this northern, so transit oriented, the whole length of Hammond Street would be
No, I'm sorry, the whole length of Route 9 east of Hammond Street.
Oh, okay. All right. So this entire block.
Yep, basically you have 150 feet. I'd extend it right down to Hammond Street.
Okay.
As a waiver. I mean, we should ask for it, but don't expect it because it's just not good retail frontage.
Okay.
I don't believe.
And Ken and Steve have hands up.
Just a quick question, George, do you, when you look at XOXO Bar and the retail next across the little parking lot there, is that something then you would anticipate where that re-tenanted, that they could change that to residential?
You know, again, I would love for retail to be there. I just don't, I think it has a low probability of success unless you have parking, you know, very establishment specific parking, and it's a destination. So, you know, yeah, residential would be the appropriate alternative use.
Okay, so
it's hard to get tenancies in good ground floor retail these days in Coolidge Corner and Brookline Village, and this is just so peripheral.
I would just point out, picking up what George was just saying, that in Brookline Village, the new medical office building has had its extensive ground floor retail space unoccupied, you know, for years at this point. I wanted to chime in. I did a pretty thorough look at this zoning, but I didn't pay particular attention to what the ground floor commercial was in the NMU block that is the Sheaf Hammond Heath block. But what I do know, since you mentioned the planning board, is that I don't know what the status of the 40B is, but the 40B project that would occupy the eastern 2/3 of that block, there was some neighborhood sentiment that that include ground floor commercial, and the planning board at the time felt that that was not going to work for the same reasons that George is stating. And I don't believe the project, and of course it's a 40B, so they wouldn't have to obey any of this. But we didn't feel that it would be a good idea to ask them to include ground floor commercial on that block. I don't know what the current zoning requires. That was one thing I happened not to look at.
That's helpful input. So currently in the NMU, there's the ground floor commercial requirement for Hammond Street and this stretch of Boylston, which it sounds like we might be extending the waiver flexibility all the way up to the corner here. So it would really just be Hammond Street.
Right. So for the purposes of 40B, which has Hammond Street frontage, the planning board did not think that was a good place for retail,
Okay.
given the difficulties in leasing ground floor space, even in our prime commercial districts.
And in terms of, Ken had pointed out that the current zoning language about sort of waiver eligibility around the ground floor was very subjective. Do other people feel that way, or do we just think that we should keep it sort of broad and flexible?
Does Raj Donda's 40B have provision for ground floor commercial space? I think it
Yes.
does, doesn't it?
I would leave it flexible so that if the town could encourage ground floor retail in any of these areas, we should try to do so, but acknowledge the reality that the developer may not really feel it's realistic or have enough interest to justify it.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful.
That's my opinion. I mean, I'd love to hear from other members of the committee. Anything else on this one, Meredith?
Nope, I was just.
So I have a couple of thoughts, George. I had my hand up.
Oh, sorry,
That's
I
okay.
don't see, I can't see that.
No worries. So a couple of thoughts here. One is in the kind of development type, right? The minute people get into podium construction, right? I've got a handful of thoughts running through my head. One is, the classic, like, can you get to something that has some kind of public engagement or provides for that opportunity in the future? I shudder to use the acronym FPA from Chapter 91, right? Because that doesn't always fly right. But the idea that, something gets built today, if it could be amenity space at the ground floor in a multifamily building or something that could then revert back to retail at some point in the future when markets change, particularly in areas kind of where you really want that retail or kind of public facing activity. A lot of what we want out of the retail is not just about destination, but it is also about making places feel good and feel like there's transparency of activity at that ground floor. I also, and I may have missed this part of the presentation, so if I did, I apologize, but is the goal that there's ground floor retail only on the frontage, if you will, like facing Route 9, or that it would also be along Tully Street and along Holly Lane and Sheaf Street, et cetera? Because while I guess my thinking along Sheaf Street today is it's commercial uses, but they're not really like walker friendly, neighborhood retail type of uses, right? It's more auto oriented, et cetera. And over the long term, it'd be great if those things transitioned, yet they're still valid commercial uses. So I want to George's point, provide for flexibility of those spaces and optionality. So I will second George's comment that having it be more flexible rather than less in terms of what the waiver is for. But I do think that there's a discussion point of, are people, like if Sheaf Street became all about front stoops, that's a different feel, and could be okay. But, having one thing that's got ground floor resi that meets the street could feel out of place. So I want to just be thoughtful about what does it mean to have this waiver, and if you're waiving, are we waiving, you know, a lot with 100 feet of frontage, or are we waiving like a whole block? And how is that done, you know, kind of piecemeal, if you will?
So right now, the blue boxes, these are the streets where the frontage is exempt from the ground floor commercial
Okay.
requirements. So Heath
Thank
Street,
you.
Sheet, Dunster are exempt. You brought up Tully and Holly Lane. So right now we do have the ground floor commercial requirement applying to both of these. And we did add some language that would allow by special permit, you know, instead of having to have, you know, 60% of Tully Street and then 60% of your Boylston Street frontage, you could pull some of your Tully Street ground floor commercial over to the Boylston Street side where it might be better used. But I guess that is another question about, does it make sense to require the entire extent of Tully and Holly to be ground floor commercial as well? Or
To me,
maybe-
it feels like my response to that would be like the part within X feet of Route 9 should be required, and the back end kind of closer to Heath Street. It should be allowed, but not a requirement, in my opinion, right? Just kind
I
of,
agree 100% with
Yeah.
what Sandy just said. Those are not good retail streets, especially those along Heath Street.
but you do want the retail to wrap that corner.
You do, right, right.
Right. But it'll just be a certain depth, right? Just whatever it is, 40 or 50 feet deep. The one thing I did want to pick up on where Sandy was going too, I thought is, if you're waiving retail, what if someone does put kind of ground floor parking, right? If it's the 5/1, just being wary of that. Like, are there there's flexibility, but there might be a couple exclusions, right? You just don't want parking garage or a lot or ground floor parking that sits right on Route 9. It's just not necessarily an inviting nor a good urban design. So
Yes, that is a very helpful point. So maybe we could include something specifically about not being able to replace that with parking. And then I liked the language Sandy was using about, you know, as long as the ground floor use provides activation in some way, like it's the amenity space or whatever, you're not walling off the ground floor space. Okay,
Right.
thank you.
And Meredith, I do think there is something right in the waiving or flexibility of if somebody's using it for amenity space, right? If they're putting in a 10-foot ceiling versus a 15-foot ceiling, that's going to severely hamper the ability for that space to convert to retail. So there are some guidelines in there. I'm not an expert. This is where I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to really write it. And so if there are things like that where we don't want to stand in the way of something getting done, we want to make sure that it gets delivered and it is an empty space for years, right? How do you provide for that with the ability for it to shift over time? Those are challenging questions, but I think, you know, to me, I'd give somebody props if they plan for retail in the long term and then but had an interim use that wasn't retail. And I pick on retail, it could be commercial too.
I wouldn't want to prohibit ground floor parking entirely, but maybe ground floor parking that fronts on Boylston or perhaps the other streets. There could be a 30-foot retail frontage with parking behind it in some cases.
Yes.
Meredith, just to jump in real quick, to answer Sandy's question, there's a minimum 15-foot height on grade across the
Thank you.
district, correct?
Yes.
Thanks, Ken.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful feedback. I will incorporate those edits into the next version of the zoning.
You know, Meredith, I think what you're hearing is that ground floor retail in this day and age is really a precious commodity. And what you want to do is concentrate it to the best areas so it has some synergies and not spread it out, hit or miss, missing tooth fashion over a longer stretch. Try to concentrate your ground floor retail because there ain't going to be a lot of it going forward.
Okay. Thank you. So other notable changes in the zoning, we did apply a 10% of the lot area minimum open space requirement for the transit-oriented sub-district. We increased the amount of hardscape for this area. So the hardscape requirements for the transit-oriented versus the 4.0 are different just based on how we think people are probably going to be accessing that space. And then we did increase, I think, given what our understanding is of the level of transportation infrastructure upgrades that is going to be needed for Chestnut Hill, we did increase the amount of transportation mitigation required from 1% of hard construction cost to 2% of hard construction costs, and then created some flexibility for much larger projects to negotiate that minimum requirement for infrastructure improvements down to 1.25% of construction costs if they're able to reach an agreement with the select board. And then we've already talked about sort of the updates we made to the neighborhood mixed use zoning, where we had previously just had it at a maximum of 6 stories and decided it was important to go back and think about opportunities to create some bonus incentives. So that's how we developed the bonus height affordable housing incentive. And then this is just an overview of where we're going from here in terms of presenting recommendations to the select board and determining whether or not we're going to move forward with the Springtown meeting warrant article proposal. EDAB on January 26th is going to have a deep dive presentation of the zoning. As one of the items here, I'd love your thoughts on what you feel would be the best way to structure that discussion so that EDAB members can get the most out of that and feel prepared going into this town meeting cycle. The planning board, we're going to be presenting on January 28th. We're going to have Sasaki. They're presenting the design guidelines, get some feedback before the warrant article filing deadline. EDAB's meeting again February 2nd. And then on February 3rd, we're going to be presenting our Chestnut Hill study recommendations and asking for direction from the select board about how we should move forward with a warrant article proposal for the spring. And then we are tentatively on the HAB's February agenda to present an update on the overlay zoning and particularly get some feedback about the affordable height bonus in the NMU. And February 25th is the filing deadline for the Springtown meeting. So I think in terms of my broad strokes updates on the zoning, that's my presentation. And I know that Ken had some thoughts and there've been some email strings about different topics people might like to tackle. So I'll turn it back to you, George.
I'm going to turn it over to my committee members. What topics would you guys like to cover today and give your feedback on?
I had one question about just the logistics of the 51% rule. Just trying to imagine a developer comes in, buys an acre of land and says, I promise to do the 51%, but they start with the 49% residential piece. How does that work? Are they forced to finish off with a commercial within 2 years of that start? Or like how does that sort of work?
We had come up with a mechanism where we withhold the C of O on the residential.
That's right. Yeah.
Until there's a groundbreaking on the commercial piece.
Okay.
But
great.
it allows the residential to proceed earlier, assuming that it's harder to pull the commercial development together.
Yep.
And Ken has a hand raised.
Ken.
George, I think while we have Steve and others from the planning board and other architects here, I'd appreciate hearing from them about the issue of how much specificity that we should put in the step backs, and also there was some reference to wall design in the zoning, and then there's a general reference to the establishment of design guidelines. I know that was a concern that was raised about the Harvard Street form-based zoning, and I would point out as a specific example am I saying this right, Meredith, that you were referring to these as cornice elements, the 6 to 12 inch step backs on the third to fourth floor, and how noticeable are those? Or is that, obviously that's an attempt to break up the building mass and the facade? And is that is that could be a very expensive little adjustment as opposed to maybe using change of materials or fenestration or other things. So there's a few things um, in the zoning that I just wonder shouldn't, if they wouldn't be better off in design guidelines.
So I would just say as an update to the zoning, so Ken, I think Kara and I were talking earlier today, we're gonna pull the reference to the cornice treatment out of the setbacks diagram, and I think that will just live in the design guidelines. So that's addressed as part of the question.
Thank you.
So Steve and Blair have hands up.
Right. Steve?
Well, first of all, Ken, thanks. Fortunately, I think that the design guidelines so far, or at least the massing guidelines, are much less restrictive than, the Harvard Street design guidelines, which I think are way over the top, specifying what kinds of windows you can and cannot use, and requiring town meeting to decide whether architects can use UPVC windows on Harvard Street, which they're using everywhere else in Brookline, for example. So I think so far so good. I have some issues with the optics of the diagrams, which I think can be very misleading. I put those in some written comments. And a bigger picture element, we know that some of there's ghosts, those diagrams that ghost in the existing buildings. And we know that some of those buildings, like the residences or residents on Boylston Street, are not likely to go anywhere anytime soon, not to mention the new 40B or 40Bs, one under construction and one who knows. But if you exempted those significant properties from these other parts of the district, how would that, because that realistically, that's what's going to happen, at least in the near term, how would that affect the zoning parameters? And I know it gets a little dicey when you say, well, this building, the residences at Boylston Place or Boylston, they're going to be here, but we're not saying anything about the residential triple deckers, elsewhere that, we're sort of consigning them to demolition. It can get dicey when you talk about individual properties, but I think from a realistic point of view, it really has a major impact on how these zoning parameters work. One other specific example is the Tully Street parking lot that is the growth companies is, I believe, 80 feet wide, and it's not part of City Realty's development unless there is some assemblage of that parcel. It looks like the growth companies has a parcel that is 80 feet wide, roughly, and very deep, but where there's a 60-foot setback at the 7th floor. So how does that work? When you also have their build-to lines or setbacks on other property lines. And there's also, to me, there's no clear definition of what the setbacks from the property line between the growth company's parcel and the City Realty parcel on that underlying, office zone. There's nothing that says what those setbacks should be when it's properties in two different ownerships. So there are little glitches there. But as far as the design guidelines are concerned, I think the big picture, I know I heard a comment, I only attended a little bit of the Monday meeting. I heard a comment that there were orders of magnitude out of whack. I don't think so. I think there are fine-grained issues here, but I think it's all heading in the right direction.
Thank you. Blair?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering whether there should be some type of a caveat or waiver available in terms of the design guidelines, so that during the DAT process, if there were some modifications that were being suggested in order to, minimize or the kind of impact on the neighborhood that was in variance of something that's written in these guidelines, that there'd be an ability to basically get a waiver through that process that would then need to be endorsed by the planning board, rather than having everything so rigid that we really don't know whether there'll be some unintended consequences. And so that would that everybody would be feeling like the planning board was feeling after the form-based zoning came through, which is, shouldn't there be a little bit of flexibility here, because if someone had a good reason to change it? So I would make some type of a language in there that would allow a waiver through the design advisory team and planning board. Thank you.
Blair, could I just follow up and say, when you're saying a waiver, because I think right now the way we're envisioning it, and we do need to add more explicit language into the zoning specifying, what the planning board's relationship with the design guidelines, but I think it would be that, the things that are dictated in the zoning, like the height and the FAR and the step backs, there are certain areas where by special permit, there can be relief provided by the planning board. And then I think we're writing the guidelines where anything not explicitly addressed in the zoning, the planning board then has the ability to go and amend the design guidelines to reflect, current trends. Is that what you're talking about?
Well,
Or are
I'm
you
thinking
talking?
about like right now, just to take that little cornice line or where a step back is. And, whether you want to have some flexibility there so that when you're looking at a specific building design that the architect has put a lot of time into, that is trying to address some issues that come up in through like the design advisory board, a process, design a team process. I'm thinking here about what went on at was it Kent Street and what was the other street there, Steve? Where we had that new project on Kent and
Webster and Kent.
yes, Webster and Kent, in which the neighborhood was really pushing hard for some step backs and some other modifications to reduce the impact. And there was this flexibility there to have it. And I'm just trying to anticipate that as this is a pretty heavy lift in terms of how big these things are going to be and whether when you're getting into the specific designs of the building that there might be some flexibility where it could be shown that, well, this little modification over here, maybe it's the setback from a particular street or something else like that, you'd only be able to get that granted through through the design advisory team process and through the planning board's approving of that.
But my specific question on that respect, I know it says that there are certain dimensional criteria where the planning board cannot give a special permit. My question is, can this go to the zoning board for a variance? That is not addressed one way or the other.
I was hoping we'd avoid a variance, which
Well,
seems to be
maybe,
a
but
higher
it's another
threshold.
route.
Just was one,
Which isn't addressed explicitly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about whether there's some that we might find ourselves with some unintended consequences that have undesirable aspects that show up as the designs with the parking and garages and everything else that's showing up. Because I don't think, I've not opined about the current, I'm going to call it schematic design, which has many areas that it could be improved, and I know it's not fully compliant with the guidelines as they're currently written. So I'm just wondering how this gets worked out as we move forward.
So I'm going to redirect our conversation to the charge of our committee, which is really to focus on the economic benefits of this rezoning and whether we feel it's realistic as a development and can actually occur. I'd like to put it to my subcommittee because I've been asked whether we think it's desirable to have a sunset provision on the overlay zoning. And the idea there is to incentivize the developer to get this done within a given time period. I'd really like to hear your opinions on that.
George, I guess one of the questions I'd have is where's the starting line, right? Is it, I think some sunset does make sense, but when are you starting? From when they get approvals, or when they buy it, or right? I mean, so that's kind of the key question, right?
Well, a sunset can be at any starting point, and then what's fulfillment of the requirement? Is it breaking ground, or is it occupancy? I mean, there are a lot of ways to structure it, but conceptually, do you think it's a good idea to incentivize a developer to have a time frame to get this done? Otherwise, he loses his opportunity to develop under the overlay.
I'm gonna jump in and say I'm not a fan, right? And the reality is that as much, this is where like the market comes to me to compete with, the town's goals. And the reality is the market is the dictator, right? Market forces are the dictator of, in almost all cases, of whether a developer is able to move forward. Most developers wanna build, right? That's what they're in the business of doing. And so when they're not building, it's because there's some structural issue in the marketplace that's preventing them from doing so. The numbers don't make sense, rents aren't climbing, the construction costs are too high. There's something that we as a town have no ability to have impact on. So, I mean, I just think about like pandemic permitting holds and then, kind of permit extensions, and the reason that those kinds of things are done is to help vest things. And I think that the permitting process, somebody still has to go get a special permit for these properties, and that's going to have some timeline on it from the time that they're given approval, I assume. I'm assuming that there's still some type of permit process where they have to get, a permit, an entitlement permit, we'll call it. If that's not the case, so be it, or a site plan approval or something that has a sunset automatically from when they get it. But I don't really like the idea of sunsetting zoning, because that's really what a rezone is for. If it's not working in 10 years, then some next group of people needs to kind of basically be having the same conversations that we're having now, saying, why isn't this working? Right? The reason we're having this conversation is because the folks that went before us, years ago, came up with something that they thought would work, right? I can only believe that they thought it would work. And we're here because it didn't. So, right, that's kind of my 2 cents. Is I don't love the idea, because I think it's rare that it's truly the developer's fault. And I don't think there's a lot that that a public entity can do to incent that, them to spend a lot of money when the numbers don't make sense.
There is most of the scenarios do require a special permit, and that will also involve site plan review and design review. So to your point, I think the concern is that this is being the height of the proposed building in the 4.0 sub-district is out of context with existing buildings that are 6 feet tall, and this would permit up to 14 stories. And the key argument for that is this is a unique opportunity for economic development within the town. And it's not just about that, but it's also that's an important point. And I think there is a sense that, how do we do what can we do best as a town to make sure that that comes to fruition as soon as possible. That said, I totally take your point. I don't think any of us control capital markets, so that's forcing an artificial time frame on that is problematic as well.
Yeah, and I hear just to kind of counter that or go back to it, Ken, I completely hear the idea that we are doing something that some construe as out of context, but the counterpoint to that is it's rare that you get to a point where if we were to dial it back, that 8 years from now, pick a number, it would need to be less, right? Which is the other piece, right? This developer is incented to do something as quickly as we can get done. So that would just be kind of some additional points. Go ahead, Mike.
I agree that the zoning should never change. I don't think there should be ever zoning on a modification of that, right? Because I think this is always in the best interest of this, the town of Brookline, for this parcel in particular to realize its full potential. I think what I do want to be careful of is someone who's just land banking, who comes in, just buys a land and sits on it for years, right? Like for whatever reason, because they're looking to flip it, sell it, whatever that. And so for those scenarios, is someone, you want to create some urgency for that scenario, right? But I don't think the underlying zoning ever should change, because I think kind of defeats the purpose of why we're all moving in this direction.
Yeah, and I think for the general audience to understand, most developers make their money on development fees and potentially carried interest. And you don't realize development fees unless you develop. So there is a strong, as Sandy has said, there's a strong incentive to get going on a development. There's little incentive to hold a money-losing property long-term. So I think what I'm hearing is consensus within this group that a sunset provision on zoning is not called for.
That's correct. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Are there any other issues within our committee that you would like to discuss today?
If I may, one of the issues that Meredith brought up was the question of FAR within the context of the 3 sub-districts, not the Chestnut Hill 4.0, but the others, and how that was changing in the zoning, and whether this committee had any opinion on whether it was reasonable to not include FAR constraints in those other sub-districts.
I'm not sure what is being asked.
So they're gonna, the proposal is to control the building mass through maximum height, setbacks, open space requirements, so that whole matrix. And that's how it was done in the Harvard-based, the Harvard Street, Main Street form-based code. But you can also go back and sort of translate that into an estimated range of FAR. For example, I think in Harvard Street, we determined that most of the lot coverage would fall somewhere between 75 and 85% if you assume that open space was put within the building setbacks. So that translated into a 3.2 or so, 3.4 FAR. And so it would be, I think it'd be useful to have that, even if it's not listed as a maximum, to sort of have that understanding so people could relate to that, because that is still part of the common vernacular. And I think Steve has got his hand raised, so I know he tried to do that exercise for the CHC3.
Steve?
Yeah, I did. And pardon me for continuing to jump in since I'm not one of your committee members, but I would just
Not
want
at
to
all.
go back and comment on a couple of the previous issues that were raised. One, I think I agree with Mark, but we are not changing the zoning here. This is an overlay. I think the underlying zoning doesn't work, but rather than changing it, we're simply establishing an overlay which is only usable under certain, if projects meet certain conditions. So I think that's okay. As far as whether this whole concept is out of context with, let's say, buildings up to 14 stories, I look at Beacon Street. The entire street is a National Register Historic District, and it's mostly 3- and 4-story townhouses and single-story commercial districts, but there are any number of 12, 14, 16-story residential buildings that appear again and again along Beacon Street. And I'm an architect and urban designer. To me, those are landmarks and focal points and wayfinding points, and they don't bother me at all. And we may be establishing a new context for a much more auto-oriented commercial section of Route 9, which to me doesn't have anywhere near the historic cachet where this has already happened on Beacon Street without destroying the fabric of the core of Brookline. Yeah, on the issue of the FAR, I call myself an old urbanist, not a new urbanist. I think FAR has worked for a very long time. I don't mind form-based light. I think Harvard Street kind of goes over the top. But my concern is that, like, especially in that CHC3, which clearly once was assumed to maybe have an FAR of 3, if you look at the massing right now, you could have, if you could build out that block per the design guidelines, never mind that there's already stuff there, you could establish an FAR that's pretty close to 7, if not 6. I mean, you can build basically a 7-story building with a minimum of 5-foot build-to line around the entire perimeter, which is also can be up to 100% facade. I forget the term. You can have the facades at 100% of those lot lines. You don't have to have any open and any breaks. So that entire block could be built to 7 stories with minimal setbacks. That's an FAR of 6 or 7. That's not what you're trying to achieve there. And that, I mean, the diagram may be accurate, but it to me looks scary. in terms of the mass that is potentially buildable on that particular block. And I would, I haven't looked as carefully at the NMU and the TOD blocks, but I think the same concerns might apply there. Without some sort of FAR limit, things could get out of hand, and unintended consequences are perhaps an outcome. Thank you.
That's very helpful feedback. I think in thinking about the 3.0, and I might ask or invite Kara to jump in based on some of the scenarios she's been playing with on that block. But because of the parking requirements, I think it's highly unlikely that it would get up to 6 or 7. But I will let Kara talk more about that.
Hello. Hi, Mark. I'm Kara Bruton. I don't know if we've met before, but nice to meet you finally. So for the purposes of getting some build out scenarios to the traffic consultant, so we're looking at the most trips that we can possibly generate to be conservative. Have been playing with some of these parcels of how they might be assembled. And I think maybe what we could do is keep the 3.0 in the FAR, as Steve is suggesting, for what was called the CHC, so whatever it is, the CHC3 district. I think it, with the parking requirements, Meredith, likely most of that being above ground, I don't think we would get much above 3 anyways. So I think that feels like a good safety net. And then maybe we leave out the FAR for some of the sub-districts to the east that NMU, because I think in some cases it might make sense to go over, slightly over 3 FAR and still have, significant tree canopy and open space and all working well. So
Kara, would above ground structured parking within the 3.0 district count in the FAR? Because the only place in Brookline where we count above ground structured parking within a building is in Coolidge Corner.
Right. And some of our overlay districts, but right now it's not being counted in the overlay.
So it would not count as into the FAR. So that doesn't necessarily impinge on, it doesn't use up FAR if we're not counting it.
No. It just, what it does is, assuming,
pushes things
especially
up.
for medical office, where you're going to have significant parking, per office space, it just bumps up from that maximum height. That's all. So I'd feel comfortable with that, Meredith, if you want to.
Yeah, I like that landed. And then there's consistency in applying the FAR in the commercial-oriented sub-districts, and we don't have to change the names of the sub-districts, which we're pretty committed to at this point. So,
Ahem.
Mr. Michael.
No, Meredith and I have been going back and forth on the names. That's all.
Again, to my committee, is there anything else that you'd like to review with Meredith or Kara, or have any other thoughts on relative to what you've seen to date?
Yeah, George, I think I'd like to just touch on a few things in the use table that the committee should opine on.
Sure.
oh, Ken, you're muted.
Sorry.
And would you like me to pull up the use table?
Sure.
Okay.
Just on the hotel uses, there's a hotel use number 5, and then if you scroll down, there's a conference facility. We know if just so the feasibility of the concept for City Realty to have a 204-room hotel with conference facilities, does the definition of the hotel encompass that, or is that separate, even if those facilities are embedded within the hotel? Because I don't think we've addressed this issue as a town. Anyway.
So we do allow for more than one principal use. And I think the event conference facilities are described in a different part of the use table.
28. Number 28.
Yeah.
There we go.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. It's split, and I'm just wondering. But does the definition of because we have hotel and limited hotel. So, anyways, I just want to make sure we're not. It seems like that's the intent of 28. If I'm understanding that correctly, is almost like a separate use independent of the hotel, or is that? anyways, there's just a clarification. The other thing on 23, I just wanted to
And
run.
so your concern is you just don't, you want to make sure that under this new zoning, event space tied to the hotel will be allowed.
Correct. I just want to make sure we're not, I mean, they're both classified as special permit, but I don't really see how you'd treat that as a separate use if it's integrated fully into the operations of the hotel. It'd be
Sounds
tied
like
to the
an
kitchen.
accessory use, right?
Right, accessory use, yeah.
So our building commissioner and the previous building commissioner have been, have directed us to want to say that multiple primary uses can be allowed, which is why we have the language at the top. But maybe what we could do, Meredith, is where we have the example of, for example, a hotel with a restaurant, can be in one building. We can just also spell out the example of hotel and conference so that it's, in the zoning as an intended example.
Sure.
And then
Thank
a question I have for EDAB is, do we want the conference use to be only accessory for, I can't imagine too much, but there's new uses happening all the time, right? Like with the puzzle game rooms or like, all these different kinds of things filling up big spaces. Do you all on EDAB think that conference space should only be allowed as accessory to something else?
No, absolutely not. If a developer can make conference space work on its own, go for it.
Yeah, I think the overarching theme is always just flexibility, right? Just that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree.
That's helpful.
Yeah, the other parameter, George, I thought, I just want to touch base with the other three of you is the 22,000 square foot limitation for retail space at grade. I know we're trying to avoid big box retail, but I was just trying to think through if there's ever like a gourmet grocery store or something like that. Is that going to be sufficient in everyone's experience that should be enough? It's probably an unlikely scenario, but I just wanted to throw that out.
So just so I'm clear, is that for not in any single space cannot exceed 22,000? Is that how that works? Because right before it says with 10 to 60,000 square feet with a ground floor not to exceed of 22,000. Is that?
Yeah, and I think the thinking was that you're trying to provide adequate space at the ground floor, but not allow for the entire scope of the.
Sort of like kind of a big box, kind of.
Yeah.
All right, I think that effectively does that.
Cliff has a hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to offer a little bit of on this aspect, having had some recent conversations on with some potential kind of retail tenants and particularly grocery tenants. I think there is definitely been, while there were over the last few years a number of grocery tenants who have been willing to kind of experiment with some smaller format, in the 15 to 20,000 square foot range. I will say that those that did are now not interested in doing that going forward, and that the market, kind of the feedback I've heard is that majority are looking for at least 25 to 30,000 on the ground floor, and maybe there's one or two who might be willing to do 20. So I'm not, I personally, I can say I do not think that our site is going to be able to handle a grocery tenant, just given all the other requirements that come with it. But I am just wanted to make sure that, on an impact from an overall zoning district, that if that holds, it will make getting another grocer pretty unlikely. I'm not going to say impossible. There are new models coming up all the time, but I've had a conversation with probably four or five major, retailers who focus on this who kind of gave me the same story.
So should we increase that limit above the 22 to 25 or 30?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. Like, I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just saying that if you do want grocery, I think you will need more to allow that to be larger. If that's kind of a neutral and you're more focused on preventing big box, then it can stay as is. I'm just wanted to kind of.
Unless can you limit it to grocery? I am concerned. Like, what if
Yeah.
Walmart or Walgreens wants to
Yeah.
come in and put a huge big, right? I think you do want to avoid that. But if it's, I mean, how big is the Trader Joe's in Coolidge Corner? Is that 15,000 square
Yeah,
feet?
way smaller, but I think that's kind of one of the groups that are like, yeah, that's a very unique case, and that's not, that's not what they're looking to do. And I've heard that a lot of them might be willing to do smaller format on locations they consider like deep urban, but like that none of them would look at this as that, and they would look for kind of hitting some of their more suburban focused, grocery requirements.
I like Mark's suggestion, though. We keep the 22 and then allow for larger footprints for, I guess you just refer to it as grocery as opposed
Yeah.
to like gourmet grocery. So.
Yeah.
We'll add that in.
Could I, while we're on uses, could I just ask a question on 31? The short-term rentals is a permitted use, and as we know, one of the proposed uses here that's an important part of the feasibility is luxury condominiums. And I think we've talked about this in the past in the town. I don't know where town council ended up on this, but most condo associations have pretty strict limitations on the minimum period of leasing. And I don't, I know in the condo I live in, it's a minimum of 12 months, but so I don't know if this was ever create a situation where you've established by right a use, and then if the association comes in and then limits that use, which would prevail, and does that undermine the value of luxury condominiums?
I think the condo association would prevail. Just because your town allows it doesn't mean that the condominium association has to buy into it.
Okay, that was my understanding as well, but I just noted that that was called out. I'm not even sure why that's in there, frankly, but
Anything else from the committee? Was that your end of your comments on uses, Ken?
yes, thank you.
Any comments from the general public?
Me again, George. Although, like Janice hasn't, I just want to
Yeah,
say something about
Janet,
the AHOC
yes.
business, but go ahead. I'll wait.
Let Janice intervene here.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation for me to listen to. I'd like to say Chestnut Hill is a historic area, and Meredith had Greer Hardwick do a fabulous historical look at the area, and I encourage you all to take a look at this this terrific piece that Greer put together that really shows the historic evolution of this area of the town. So, but what I want to talk about is sort of wearing my Chestnut Hill Village of Lions hat, which is a Newton Brookline association. That the way we actually live in this area, we don't live in it as Brookline and Newton. We live in it as a whole area. And so, so in talking about making a vibrant commercial area, I think that you shouldn't look at Route 9 as a divider, but really look at Brookline as an extension of the commercial area that's already there. Because what we really want is people to use both sides of Route 9. So what concerns me about the Kittleson study is that it's about cars. And I really want us to focus also on pedestrian connectors. That's how we use the area. And that's what will, in fact, bring vibrancy to the Brookline side of the commercial area. And I think that shouldn't, I think we tend to put blinders on. We look at Brookline, but in fact, we breathe the whole area. And I think it would really be an advantage to us to look at ours as an extension of the street in a way, that commercial vibrancy should come across and we should have much more interactions. and think of this space in that more holistic way. So that's why when you talk about waivers along Boylston Street, I'm not sure that they should be given at all, because we don't want people to think about a waiver. We want them to think about it as a commercial area. And by even suggesting that, it plants a seed for something that we may not really want to encourage. I certainly don't want to encourage that. So I think those are some important inputs from the people who actually live in the area to understand the area better. That would also, I think, help with parking, frankly, because then people who park at the street and want to use our businesses, if we had better connectors, pedestrian connectors, it would take some of the stress off of us having to, in isolation, provide so much parking. And I'm not saying that we should negotiate with WS Development to allow us to park there. I'm just thinking about the end users, the people who are going to want to come and go to the restaurants and go to shops. I think that we need to just sort of change the way we're looking at the area just a little bit. And with that in mind, I think we do have to, I agree you don't need to sunset the zoning. That doesn't make sense to me either, to create an overlay zoning to sunset. I think that what we want to do, though, is encourage development to happen. And so I am a little, I think I don't have all the clarity that I heard about withholding the certificate of occupancy until they break ground for the commercial, should they start with the housing. Because the experience that we've had at Hancock Village was they didn't get their certificate of occupancy, and yet they were renting the rooms and they couldn't come on our SHI. It seems that that was a failure in that way, because they actually were renting their rooms at least 6 to 8 months before they actually got their certificate of occupancy. And it was really a problem for the town because, well, because we know how the numbers work. And so I'm not sure. I think that needs to be thought out a little bit more carefully, how we incentivize the building of the commercial, which is really what we want to incentivize in the commercial area. So I'm just thinking it needs a little bit more, a little deeper thought on how to achieve the goal that really that I think that the town very much wants to achieve. So, and I think those are, let's see, I think, yep, that's my comments.
Dennis,
Thank you.
I think your comment about the C of O using that as a gating mechanism is an issue of enforcement, but we could also tie it even to a TCO, the issuance of a TCO, which is a temporary certificate of occupancy, which allows people to partially use.
Yes.
And you know what, that's an excellent point. So we can talk about that one in terms of the gating mechanism before any CO or TCO is issued for the residential.
I like that much better. Thank you, Cole. George. Yeah, thanks, George.
And the other thing that I just want to make clear is that I was suggesting a waiver for the street front retail east of Hammond Street. Everything across from the street would not be subject to a waiver.
Right, although that's not how it reads on what Meredith showed online. It's on both edges of Route 9, and it's really based, to me, it seems to be based on the proposal that's that we've been talking about. But the actual vibrant commercial area actually is on the other side of Hammond Street. Really, I don't think our commercial area is all that vibrant. It's got bank after bank after bank, and we could do something.
No, I was referring to the area across from the Longwood Cricket Club.
Yeah, no, I am too. I mean, that is actually kind of a vibrant area. It's got the liquor store, it's got the you know, and there are houses past it, but that's like a mini office park, mini, not office, well, like mini commercial area, because you drive in, it's got its own parking lot. I know people that use the services there. There's a aesthetics, you know, company, business there that is very popular. Um, and then the restaurant there is also bringing in a lot of people. In fact, we
Okay.
need to really look at, I think the way we park in that area could be looked at a little bit better so that we can enhance the ability of those commercial businesses that are there now to do better and to have their customers make it easier for their customers to come in and out. Right now, it's actually dangerous to pull in and out of that spot. And I know we closed off the back Heath Street for a reason, and that was also safety. But I think that when we look at, I don't think Kittleson really looked at that part of the area as closely. I think it really stopped at Hammond Street, and that maybe it would be really good to, you know, to think of that as part of our vibrant commercial area. I am hoping that the 40B on the corner really does follow through with the commercial tenants. It's certainly advertised for commercial tenants. And they had a very popular tenant before. Oishi was extremely popular. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Carla?
Thank you. And George, I'm glad you clarified that you were referring to the sub-district across from Longwood. I've been focused on that piece of this entire study area because it's closest to my neighborhood. 88 feet maximum for the height of that building, I personally feel is too great. As some of you may know, that area is a sort of the introduction or the beginning of the local historic district of Newton. And it's maybe a block and a half away from Brookline's local historic district. My feeling is there's not enough space to transition from a building, a 7-story building, into two residential areas that are recognized for their architectural significance. And the other thing is, and this is really sort of a footnote, Steve, I'm hard pressed to think of a 16-story building on Beacon Street. And I must say, I have spent way too much time counting stories of buildings on Beacon Street when I'm stopped at red lights and I get honked a lot. People honk at me a lot because I'm very busy counting stories. Can't think of one, let alone more than one. I know there's a 13-story high building. I know that Regency Circle has a very tall component, but that piece is set considerably well back from Beacon Street. And the height is really more on the facing the parking lot or the driveway of the Star Market. So thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, Carla, I was throwing around some numbers in the teens. I'm not sure how tall many of those buildings are, but they're definitely more than 10. Anyway, I just wanted to add on the specific issue. First of all, thanks for letting me chime in on multiple topics here. On the specific notion of the additional height for projects within certain parts of this district that do at least 50% affordable housing, as Meredith said, that goes back to the results, the findings and recommendations of the HAB's Affordable Housing Overlay District Study Committee. And for those that want to look into it in more depth, if you go to the Housing Advisory Board's website, you will find a link to a final report of the AHOD subcommittee to the HAB, which is about 6 pages, a very cogent summary. And then at the back of that document is a link to all of the background material, of which the first one is the feasibility study that we commissioned RKG Associates to do. And initially our mandate was to look at what it would take to make 100% affordable housing feasible and how much additional height and FAR would be required. And we were surprised and pleased to find, and even though this was beyond our mandate, that projects with 53% market rate and no, actually, I think 53% affordable housing and 47% market rate housing are actually feasible. And they looked at, investment criteria, rates of return. I know Ken is a little bit dubious. I've talked with him about this a lot. Maybe in the current
I'm dubious as well, Steve.
in the current interest rate and construction cost environment, maybe not. But if you look at RKG's analysis and they looked at investors' parameters, it not only appears to be feasible, and of course there are, because of the affordable housing component, there are certainly tax credits, et cetera, available. But what would not be required, according to RKG, would be town contributions from the Housing Trust Fund or other town monies. Those projects could be feasible with other sources of funding and tax credits for affordable housing with a 53% market component. So worth looking at. So that's where you find it, the HAB page. Thank you.
George,
Ken?
I know we're running out of time here. Can I throw a couple quick ones out to the subcommittee?
Please.
On paragraph 7 at the bottom of page 10 and top of page 11, I'm not a big fan of maximum parking restrictions because I think usually the economics of a project take care of that. But I was struck by limiting general office use number 7 to a max of 2 per 1,000 square feet. I think you could find certain office users that require more. I would hate that restriction to be artificially established, and I would recommend that we move that up to at least 3. And then studio
Agree
apartments.
with that one.
And in studio apartments in this location, the max is set at 0.5. And again, you might have more people than not in this location that would want a car, even if their unit's a studio. So again, I don't see any. City Realty is not proposing any studios on their site, but studios are certainly a reasonable component of a future mix. And I would just encourage us to change that to a 1.0. And then I have some comments we can decide that now or move or table that for a later time. I am a little confused as to the minimum bicycle parking requirements in this location. It seems like the focus needs to be much more on outdoor bike racks as opposed to indoor or within the building minimum bike parking standards. And I think that like referencing bike parking minimums based on the number of rooms of the number of per room of hotel use. I know that's a general metric of the size of a hotel, but it's also I can't see a lot of people, riding down Route 9 with their luggage heading to the hotel. So it kind of gives that image. So I just, I don't know that this makes sense. This seems like a kind of a arbitrary thing. And then last, I would just ask the committee to be aware that on paragraph 13, there is an allowance for larger signs. My comment on that to Meredith was that this is, I think, an underappreciated element of being able to secure some anchor commercial tenants. And so I think we should give the developers in this area the ability to take advantage of the Route 9 location and have adequate signs that are of sufficient size to be able to be seen in their on the horizon as people are driving east and west on Route 9. Thank you.
We will definitely look into all of that, Ken. I think those are great points about the bike parking requirements and signage. And my goal is to update the zoning over the weekend and be able to circulate an updated draft early next week. So I'd appreciate any additional thoughts or comments people might have. And then, Ken or Steve and people who have reached out with specific comments, you will probably be hearing from me next week for a follow-up discussion just to make sure everything's covered.
Yeah, just to echo Ken, anything we can do to facilitate and make it user-friendly for commercial users, i.e. parking, I think is the goal, right? So 100% agree with where Ken was going.
So
So not
George,
seeing any other hands raised and understanding that we collectively are standing between all the participants and their weekends, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
so George, we just had the minutes vote though.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Sorry.
Move approval of the minutes from our last meeting dated.
So 2 sets, October 24th and November 7th.
Move approval.
Yeah, I second.
Ken,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
Sandy,
Yes.
and I vote yes. Done.
Thank you. And then, sorry, one last thing, and this is just for a follow-up. As we gear up for the EDAB presentation on January 26th, are there any subcommittee members who might have a little extra capacity over the next week to just help me organize my thoughts and make sure that presentation is as concise but informative as it needs to be?
Meredith, I'd be happy to help you with that.
And I'm happy to help too.
Yeah, I can chime in too. You send it out. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Bye.
Move to
Thank you.
adjourn.
Move to adjourn. Seconded.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Bye.
On to your beers.
Have a
collectively.
great weekend.
Thanks,
Thank
George.
you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.